Good morning, everybody. How are you doing? All right. Let me just preface this by saying that I, in the last 6 months, have read 2,500 pages of Philip K. Dick and taught a class that produced 64 hours of content. And I'm a little mentally unbalanced by the whole project. And I wanted to have fun with you guys today. So this is not an academic lecture. This is not a, it's somewhere between fun and whatever. You're happy this is not an academic lecture. Good. Somewhere, the idea is to have fun. And we're going to talk about boobs and all that stuff. So here we go. Some thoughts after a semester spent dicking around. The total Dickhead's Guide to Philip K. Dick had over 50 enrolled students. We read 2,500 pages of Philip K. Dick. Guests included Jonathan Lethem, Umberto Rossi, Eric Davis, Ted Hand, William Cyril, Ted Powers, Peter Finning, Linda Levy, you name it. It was incredible. Produced 64, I've gone over this already, but 64 hours of content, 1,000 PowerPoint slides. It's available now to purchase through Morbid Anatomy, which is the wonderful online college. Some footnotes for I have not read a whole lot of. I'm not a big fan. And so I got really interested in this one aspect of the exegesis, which is this idea that Phil was going to place this message he's thinking about placing this message in the cultural unconscious. And so this is right after he's declined to write a novelization tie-in to Blade Runner. We also have to say, this is at a moment of on the verge of his greatest success, monetarily, in terms of stature, and the movie company wants him to shelve Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, write a novelization of the screenplay, and they would then shelve Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. It wouldn't be published. They offered him, I'm going to go forward just a bit here just to show you, that the deal was if Phil agreed to the novelization, he could write it himself for $50,000 advance, which is more advance than he ever got, plus 50% cut of net profits from all print media tie-ins, souvenirs, magazines, posters, comic books, etc. If the film was a smash, which it was looking to be, Phil could stand to earn $250,000 to $400,000, which is $1.3 million in our time today. And he turned that down. And he wrote in his exegesis around that time, "Why am I so joyful? I am celebrating a victory and can now stop work, finally, and relax. Why? Because I did my job and I know it." What was the job? To get the third dispensation in print. And I did so in Androids. I need do nothing else in my life. The Tagore vision, the Godhead expanding into the ecosphere, animal kingdom. Okay, there are other aspects. I didn't sell out to Hollywood, do the novelization or permit the novelization, suppress the original book. And in view of what the film is about, it would have destroyed me for 2 reasons, not one. A, the Tagore vision in Androids, which as far as we can tell is a sensitivity to the environment and the dystopian depiction of the environment in Blade Runner, which was the main thing that Phil saw in those daily screening when he went with Ridley to watch those. So he's got the Tagore visions in Androids, which he thinks is going to make it to the screen on Blade Runner, and then the Heinlein power fantasies in Blade Runner. I have no idea what that's all about. When we're going to use Gabriel's tool to figure out if we can find other aspects of the Heinlein power fantasy and use that. These are antithetical, and they express the opposing kingdoms, Christ, androids, and Satan, Blade Runner. Notice this use of the possessive, right? He's talking about an alternate worlds, good and evil, which is really interesting. Look what it would have done to me spiritually and psychologically and politically. My soul is safe, and it was in jeopardy. This is why I see victory despite the vast defeat. So this is something I'd never heard about with the exegesis, that there's this element of what he calls his charisma. This is the Tagore letter, which is something that Philip K. Dick sent to an editor of a magazine as well as about 80 of his friends. It was written in September 23rd, 1981, about 6 months before he died. And the key nut of the graph is Tagore's Kerygma, which is the third dispensation following the Mosaic and Christian, is the ecosphere is holy, must be preserved, protected, venerated, and cherished as a unity. Not the life of individual men or individual animals, but the ecosphere as a single indivisible, unitary whole, a life chain that is being destroyed, and not temporarily, but for all time. And this is nestled in a letter that reads kind of weird. It says, my friend's name is Horse Lover Fat, and he has these visions, and blah, blah, blah. Within that crazy letter, this is some of the sanest shit you're going to see today. And it was written in 1981, way before our ecological concerns of the current day. And so this is what he's imagined. So I want you to understand the sort of scale of his vision, right? That he is like the Mosaic and Christian dispensations of the past, where he's receiving information, a message directly from God, and his job now is to send that out into the world. And that's a big part of the exegesis, and it's a big part of an aggrandized, exaggerated sense of self-importance that Philip K. Dick seemed to have. Okay, he says here, and you can just see how he's working in his mind a way to kind of rationalize his new belief about having put this message in Blade Runner. A strange and mysterious strategy to put the new Kerygma in the novel published in the late 60s, but then disclosed to me only now, toward the end of 1981. But just at the time that we get the signed contract with the Blade Runner people to re-release the novel in conjunction with the film. As if the Valis trilogy has diverted everyone's attention, my own included. Like when the thought came to me that the true message was in Frozen Journey and not in Valis. The true message is not in Valis, but it is, I now think, in androids, and it will have the greatest circulation, probably, of all. Isn't that convenient? Viewed in terms of God's strategy, Blade Runner has been used as a means to an end. The end being the Kerygma in androids, which is this message about the environment. Thus, to have suppressed androids and either written or authorized the novelization based on the screenplay would have been to hand over victory to evil. But this did not happen. The fully executed contract between Blade Runner and me regarding the re-release of androids was waiting for me in the post office box on Friday. I asked Powers about this a little bit. He didn't remember Phil talking about the environment in any way. He didn't remember any of this stuff. And from what I got from Powers, this is a lot more intense in terms of its level of involvement and belief on Dick's part than most of what Powers seemed to think Dick was sort of speculating on. Powers' belief is that Dick's speculation is very episodic. It never ends and it's always shifting. There seems to be some places where he really does dig in. He wrote in Gabriel McKee helped me find this in folder 91. This is unpublished. My God, I'm totally fucked up. I saw the footage from Blade Runner tonight, and the Sufi Dante 3 realm theory is correct. So again, we've got to look up the Dante 3 realm theory. When I saw the Black Iron Prison, AI was remembering hell. I was not in hell. I was remembering having been, but was now in Purgatorio. So it's a little out there. He writes to Greg Rickman, seeing the short clip from Blade Runner, I realized that in my writing I've been saying we are dead and in hell. This is especially true in Ubik, where my message becomes explicit. P.S. It really freaked me out to see that clip of Blade Runner, as you can see by this letter, which is a pretty weird letter. My God, the world I write about is hell, literally. And anyone with sense will recognize it when they see the movie. Trumbull has caught it absolutely. How extraordinary. What genius. What scene, what frame was absolutely in the footage that Phil saw that day with Ridley Scott and Mayor Wilson? This one, right? It's got to be, right? It has to be. Got to be the opening clip, right? And so you can see from this that he's like, oh my God, they've got, and this is sort of what he said, they've got my vision of the world. And that vision of the world included this ecological collapse. There's the message. That's basically it. Okay. So then I was interested because there's a lot of like really weird, explicitly Christian imagery in the movie. So I contacted Paul M. Salmon, the author of The Making of Blade Runner Future Noir, asked him about where did these, because if you look in the original scripts, you can't find these written up. So I said, where did they show up? Paul says, White Pigeon was Rutger's idea during the scene shoot. Okay? Not in the script, improvised on the set. Nail through the hand, another during filming idea. Okay? So much was added, dropped, changed during the production. Heads were spinning like over-caffeinated tops, Paul M. Salmon with the simile there for the win. Which means Rutger's kerygma is it's through salvation in Christ that we become truly human. And that's the message of the imagery that concludes Blade Runner, correct? Phil believed that with Vallis's assistance, he had inserted a crucial salvific message into the mainstream unconscious. The irony, of course, is that Dick was terrified of being manipulated by secret messages in the media that he was consuming. That's a little bit rich, right? Okay, very good. Okay, so episode 1, that's the end of this. That's the Blade Runner stuff. Let's move on to boobs. All right, in the fantastic pocket guide to Philip K. Dick, Dr. Andrew M. Butler describes a recurring dynamic in Phil's fiction. If the typical serviceman is married, it's usually to a woman who doesn't understand him, a castrating harpy or bitch figure. It's nice that he capitalized bitch there. The serviceman is often distracted from his wife by a younger woman, often dark-haired, described as if she were the spirit of femininity with particular attention paid to the breasts. There was a blog site called Frolics8. It's still online, but it's no longer active. And this guy, he was a British blogger. I never found out his name, but we communicated a lot. We had a great email conversation. He went through a ton of books, and he found all the boob references. So he made this work real easy for me. I just went through and found a few to make my point, right? Here's from the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. She had a narrow, erect body, a truly superb carriage, and small, up-jutting breasts with nipples no larger than matched pink peas, or rather, matched pink pearls. It's interesting that he moves from a food item to a jewelry item. What matters with a fox is nice tits, is what he says in Scanner Darkly. In Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, we have the negative, like a bad woman, a cold woman has small breasts. Rachel's proportions, he noticed again, were odd. With her heavy, massive dark hair, her head seemed large, and because of her diminutive breasts, her body assumed a lank, almost childlike stance. In Scanner Darkly, there's this thing where I think it's Bob Actor takes us down. I took down the volume. It turned out to be discovered the picture book of sexual love. My parents had this when I was a kid. Opening at random, he perceived a page which showed a man happily nibbling happily at a chick's right tit and the chick sighing. Food related. Phil Dick's twin sister Jane died in infancy. Yes?
No cosmic puppet boob mountain?
Well, you know, come on. At the end of Cosmic Puppets, he drives off through a couple of boobs. That's true. It's hard to get in as just a kind of a single sentence. Philip K. Dick's twin sister Jane died in infancy because her mother failed to produce enough milk to sustain them both. Often in Dick's fiction, the unfeeling, apathetic women characters were depicted as flat-chested. A lot of these characters are also based, at least in part, on PKD's mom, Dorothy. Hey, there's a picture of her. I'd never seen this one until recently. False advertising. From an evolutionary perspective, breasts serve as advertisements for a person's ability to nourish a child. Strangely, very few people are thinking about the nourishment of their children when ogling breasts. There's a disconnect, a kind of natural manipulation at work. The nature of things is in the habit of concealing itself. There's a little bit of information here. Breast size is not a good indicator of future milk production, says La Leche League of Canada. Right? Approximately 70% of the glandular tissue is found within a 1 inch radius of the nipple. So what would Philip K. Dick make of breast implants? He missed the fad in Hollywood and elsewhere of the silicone breasts that I think made their appearance later in the 80s. In the one hand, Phil seemed to like them big. In the other hand, the manipulation is compounded and mechanized. Hey, these fake breasts won't nourish my kid at all. And we have some sort of strange, if you just look up robots with big boobs on Google and you turn the safe search off, this is what you get. Okay, so is this like a cybernetic, post-human thing? Well, cyborg is not. I did all my research, by the way, on Wikipedia in the spirit of Phil Dick and his love for encyclopedias. Cyborg is not the same thing as bionics, biorobotics, or androids. It applies to an organism that has restored function or especially enhanced abilities due to the integration of some artificial component or technology that relies on some sort of feedback. For example, prostheses, artificial organs, implants, and in some cases, wearable technology. So a breast implant is not cybernetic in that regard. But the boundaries are soft. In the Cyborg Manifesto, Donna Haraway rejects the notion of rigid boundaries between humanity and technology, arguing that as humans depend on more technology over time, humanity and technology have become too interwoven to draw lines between them. She believes that since we have allowed created machines and technology to be so advanced, there should be no reason to fear that we have created, and cyborgs should be embraced because they are now part of human identities. Or as Love and Rockets once said, you cannot go against nature because when you do go against nature, that's part of nature too. Those Brits are always so good at summing it up. However, Haraway has also expressed concern over the contradictions of scientific objectivity, interesting, and the ethics of technological evolution, and has argued that, quote, there are political consequences to scientific accounts of the world. Interesting to think about. All right. Lots of science fiction writers were obsessed with boobs, and they didn't have twin sisters that died of starvation. So maybe it's something else. This is my copy of Robert Anton Wilson's The Book of the Breast. Ted Hand offered this insight. I'd also like to think of the literary content of imitating the Beat Generation. Dudes feeling liberated to let out their horny, no matter how misogynistic. Adding, like you get to this new freedom to do something edgy, let's spray paint the secretary's breasts blue. What are some Dickian alternatives to boob jobs? This is where it gets interesting, guys. Drugs or mind control rays that exaggerate breast size in our perception, right? These could be individualized. Individual people could wear them to do their own body stuff. Or it could be universal, like you could get everybody could be perceived in a particular way. People could strap transmitters to their body, which force others to see them as they want to be seen. But what if at a deeper level, it's possible to manipulate our attitudes towards breasts? Dial a 469 on the Penfield mood organ. Satisfaction with your partner's breasts, regardless of their size. Or a 764, disdain for corporeality. There's all kinds of ideas and attitudes we could have in there. We could have a monkish attitude towards sex that we need to preserve our sexual energy, whatever. When the ability is to impose a mood, a thought, or an ideology, the vector of control is on a whole other level. A lot of what we did in class was talk about these basic ideas that background Philip K. Dick's writing, like the difference between the modern and the postmodern. So in the modern, you have the analog. You have a culture that produces objects. You have mechanical operation, and you have bras. In the postmodern, you have the digital as opposed to the analog. You have a culture that produces information rather than objects. You have circuitry rather than mechanical operations. And maybe you have breast implants instead of bras. In a lot of cases, the difference between the modern and the postmodern is not qualitative. It's just a difference in intensity or extremity, right? And there are very porous boundaries between these ideas. Let's talk for a moment about Wilder Penfield, upon whom the Wilder Penfield, the Penfield mood organ is named. This is Wilder Penfield in 1907, photographed at the Galahad School. This is Ruth Penfield. She was my great-grandmother. And Wilder Penfield was her uncle. No, I'm sorry, her brother. My grandmother's uncle. Wilder Penfield was a pioneering brain surgeon, a Rhodes Scholar trained at Oxford. Look at this guy. these are my genes, folks. A Rhodes Scholar trained at Oxford and Princeton, Penfield believed studying medicine was the best way to make the world a better place. Penfield later became Montreal's first neurosurgeon and established the Montreal Neurological Institute in 1934. There's still a neurological school in Toronto named after him, and if you know a neurologist, you just mention Wilder Penfield and they will light up because they've talked about him a lot in their studies. By 1950, Penfield experimented with using electrical probes to treat seizure activity in the brain while the patient was fully awake. I have a great uncle, who saw some of those surgeries. I said, could you hear him talking in the surgery? He said, when they stopped talking, that wasn't a good sign. This surgery, called the Montreal procedure, led to a greater discovery. Stimulating certain parts of the brain could evoke memory recall, like the smell of burnt toast, and that's the most famous sort of example. Penfield's contributions to modern neuroscience elevated Canada's global status in healthcare science and discovery, while his innovations created better lives for people with epilepsy. That's from the Canadian Board of promoting their great citizens or something. Where this takes place in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is where it gets really interesting. We have this exchange between the husband and wife, Iran and Deckard. And the first thing Iran says to Deckard is, I don't want to be awake. And Dick actually puts want in italics. Because that's key. It's a really important verb, and I'll show you why in this next passage. On and on, Deckard responds eventually. He says, look, forget what you've scheduled, and I'll forget what I've scheduled. We'll dial a 104 together and both experience it. And then you stay in it while I reset mine for my usual business-like attitude. That way, I'll want to hop up to the roof and check out the sheep and then head for the office. When I teach this book, which I've taught to over 2,000 college freshmen at San Francisco State University, I say this is the scariest word in the book, right? And I have to explain it to them. So I'll say, imagine that I give you a pill that makes you obsessed with the English language and with this class. And you take this pill, and as a result, every waking hour is spent writing and revising your homework or reading these great works that I've assigned to you. At the end of the semester, who earned the A? Not you. And that's what's so important. As Soren Kierkegaard says, the greatest hazard of all, losing the self, can occur very quietly in the world, as if it were nothing at all. And that's absolutely what's happened to Deckard at the beginning of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. He's entirely a robotic mechanism that does what he's told, programs himself to get into the right state of mind. So let's get back to postmodernism a little bit. According to Wikipedia, scholar Hans Bertrand offers the following. If there is a common denominator to all these postmodernisms, oh, by the way, postmodernism is like impossible to define, in part because there were these idiots who decided to call themselves modernists, right? I'm a modernist. What the hell does that mean, right? And what is supposed to come after that? It's a kind of terminal label. I think that was what they were after. Like, if we call ourselves modernists, nobody can ever be anything after us. Anyway, when you dig down and you really try to talk about what postmodernism is, which is essentially just a steroid growth mutation of modernism, you get this idea. The common denominator is that a crisis in representation, a deeply felt loss of faith in our ability to represent the real in the widest sense. No matter whether they are aesthetic, epistemological, moral, or political in nature, the representations that we use to rely on can no longer be taken for granted. Burns' definitions have to do with the stability of external reality. While part of its point may be that we're not always aware of the way our material conditions affect our perception, postmodernity still refers to conditions in the outside world, the koinos cosmos. What will we call the next era when our own worlds, our idios cosmos, can be technologically manipulated by others? So we have the postmodern, digital, and what I'm calling the idios modern, we have the experiential. What the form of these the form that technological innovations will take in the future will be experience. You will experience these technologies. You won't understand them, you will experience them. You will have a culture that produces experience and beliefs instead of content. You will have brain architecture and chemistry instead of circuitry. And you'll have the idea of nice boobs beamed into your head as opposed to breast implants or wonderful boobs on TV. These are basically just differences in degree, right? I could go back to this. Do we already have a culture that produces experience and beliefs?
Yes.
Yes, we do. But notice that what it does is it produces those beliefs out there, and then we use our senses to transport them inside. Again, when you can lose that middleman and you can transmit directly into the mind, the vectors for control are off the charts. We can choose to knowingly experience inaccurate perceptions. We can have our perceptions altered without our permission. Will our experience of reality be altered directly without our permission? Is this a useful metaphor for our current state of affairs? And of course, taken to its logical degree, this is where you end up with a kind of idios modern, with an entirely false reality that is separate from what's outside. Our culture already produces, distributes, and reinforces beliefs in incredibly complex and technologically sophisticated ways. Nevertheless, the technology of direct machine-human interfacing is being developed as we speak, in part by my friend Jeff here. Unceasingly, Phil Dick says, we are bombarded with pseudo-realities manufactured by very sophisticated people using very sophisticated electronic mechanisms. I do not distrust their motives, I distrust their power. And that power is about to go through the roof. And so when people say, well, Philip K. Dick's a postmodern writer, in some ways he is, and in some ways he's a writer that's beyond postmodern. He's in some realm that we've yet to define because we've yet to encounter it. But he's already there, and you can see it very clearly in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. What is at stake in this new reality, which we may see, but I would bet our kids will see, is ourselves, is the most basic aspects of ourselves. And guess what? That's what's at stake in our current mess, right? I know that my mom spends a lot of time watching MSNBC, and it has absolutely altered her personality. And and my dad watched a lot of Fox News. It absolutely altered his personality. I have spent a lot of time on Twitter, and I know that has altered my personality. So, in a lot of ways, this is kind of academics. Well, you're talking about the future, but no, you're not. It's like Orwell's 1984. It's 1948, and the problems that Dick was describing in the future are the problems that we're having now. But ironically, we're going to have the real problems that he was describing too. We were using them as like a figurative idea, like a kind of a symbol to work with to get some stuff straight in our heads. We're really going to have to deal with it. They're really going to be able to make us think things. The example I like to use for my students is like, imagine if they could beam something into your head so that when you paid your Comcast bill, you had an orgasm. Right? And like maybe they'd start a payment program where if you pay a little extra, the orgasm's even better, and they'll top it off with a little dash of, and you don't have to feel guilty about having an orgasm from paying your Comcast bill on top. So it's not just our perceptions that can be altered. It's our ideology, it's our beliefs, it's who we are. And the great thing about Philip K. Dick and Deckard's story is a kind of way out. That these are dynamics that we can escape. We can shut our computers off. We can refuse to engage in the kind of political rhetoric that are so consuming and destructive in our lives right now. All right? Any questions? I got 15 minutes for questions, don't I, Lord Running Clan? I do.
I'm just reminded and it's close to where Phil was talking about how it was already here in terms of television.
Yeah.
Where he has that specific example of the lack of movement of the eyes convinces the brain that nothing is happening when we watch TV.
Yeah.
And therefore the images are going direct past the hemisphere where the personality is. And so he's telling us that the direct...
Is that in the same speech he does that?
Yes, the direct beaming is all
Man,
happening.
boy, I should have looked a little further. That'd be a great thing to have in there. Well, thank you for mentioning that. That's really important.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Good. Yes, Ted.
So I'm going to be that obnoxious guy at a conference and phrase my question in the form of a comment. Now, I'm sure I'll have a question for you at the end of this. I'm really interested in this Penfield mood organ stuff, and I loved the way you said that this word want is the scariest thing.
Yeah.
You know, this is the horror that we should have been talking about last night in David's podcast. And we've got a visitor from Anti-Oedipus Press here.
Yeah.
So I thought I would do a little bit of explication of like what's this anti-Oedipus thing about.
Yeah.
You know, Dave is very concerned with like kind of Freudian reading of Dick and looking into stuff like Binswanger's existential psychology. And so there is this French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, who, in collaboration with Felix Guattari, came up with this idea of anti-Oedipus. They talked about capitalism and schizophrenia. And I believe Deleuze was a dickhead. I'm not, correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, he said all philosophy is science fiction, right?
Yeah, and he was interested in stuff like Frank Herbert's Dune.
Yeah, okay.
And I follow this podcast, and if you want to get into this stuff in philosophy, it's called Acid Horizon. And if you're like a psychedelic person who's interested in postmodern philosophy, check out this podcast anyway. These guys are very also hung up on Wilhelm Reich's idea of desire, and desire having so much to do with the psychology of fascism. And I think that this is a great way of kind of explicating like what we know Dick is doing with capitalism and projected realities and desire. And basically, it all boils down to this question. And there's a lot of like critical theory, like Frankfurt School kind of like communist thinking that also ties into this is, how is it that people have come to desire their own repression?
Yeah.
Right, so I guess I've come to my question for you, Dave. How is it that
That's your question?
speak to this question of how do people, it's like, do we dial in, 1984 on the Penfield mood organ in order to desire our own repression?
How do we get caught up in desiring our own repression? Well, freedom is a bummer, man. Right? Because if you're free, then you're also responsible. Right? If I make a decision that ends in a terrible outcome, who made that decision? Right? When you talk to the Nazi soldiers, they would say, we're finally free. And they would say, what are you free from? And they say, we're free from the terrible burden of freedom. So I would say that that's the catch that we're trying to get out when we lock into our own repression, is like just trying to skirt our own responsibility. The way we do in all kinds of interpersonal, professional, social situations, right? You just want to avoid having that tail pinned on you. Well, or it's Deckard's method of recognizing the suffering of the people around him, and that he's a part of that, and that he is not obligated to inflict that on others. He can choose to step back and live a life in a different way. And that is absolutely an avenue that's open to all of us, and one of the truly beautifully liberating ideas in Dick's fiction.
I was going to throw in a real mundane kind of example that people could probably relate to a lot. It's like if you're hanging out with your partner or a couple people or whatever, and somebody has to pick where you're going to eat.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Nobody really wants
That's
to pick
right.
where they're going to eat, and everyone's going to blame them if it's not good.
Yep.
You're just kind of like,
Yep.
So you get like choice paralysis.
Yeah.
Everyone's indifferent.
Right.
Or there's the one that, I don't want to go there.
Wilson.
Yeah, no, to your point, that's certainly something that Dick pursues in the exegesis.
Yeah.
Right? This notion of infinite regression.
Yeah.
and so forth.
Hey, that's the
Who better to talk about this than Jonathan Latham sitting at there?
Well, I don't want to spill too much of my plan for tonight.
Oh,
but
okay.
Duluth was already in the mix
That's good.
in the
We'll wait,
conversation.
we'll wait.
And no, I don't want to just tease it, but I'm thinking with this too. I mean, it'll change what I say, and this I can build on a lot of this in a very rich way. What strikes me is that I'm just going to create a pregnant question here. This isn't really one that you have to try to tackle, or a remark that's meant to reverberate out of this. But so if we're terrified of freedom, and that is the avenue by which it's very easy to induce our craving for repression, because it reduces this anxiety, what is the implication of freedom or the responsibility that freedom entails? It's to free the other.
Yeah.
It's not just to experience freedom,
Yeah.
but to regard another being who is different from you and wish freedom for them as well.
And that's why this scene in The Matrix is so intense. After he realizes that he's in this vat of goo, he looks around, and everywhere he sees, everyone is in view. And that is what it is to be radicalized.
I will hesitate here and say, there's nothing in this scene that requires Neo to accept a result in the other achieving freedom that he can't identify with. And that's the real passage. You know, freedom is terrifying because it entails responsibility to free the other. The other might have a self that you don't identify with, that you don't recognize, but you still are accepting responsibility for wishing them to experience freedom on their terms. Okay? That's where the complexity comes in, right? Coexistence.